Hello, my name is Fadima Gure from the TCAF programming team. Before we begin, the Toronto Comic Arts Festival would like to honor and acknowledge the original caretakers of the land where TCAF is situated, the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Haudenosaunee, and Huron-Wendat peoples. We are in a territory that was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon, One Pump Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, Haudenosaunee, and allied nations to share and care for the land. We also acknowledge that this area is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. TCAF makes this acknowledgement as a reminder that we are all treaty people and that we have a responsibility to the land and each other. This acknowledgement is a touchstone in our process of thinking through what it means to live and work on colonized land, and is an expression of solidarity with our Indigenous siblings. TCAF commits to strengthening its relationship with Indigenous communities in Toronto and increasing Indigenous voices and perspectives in our programming in 2022 and beyond. Welcome to our virtual program titled Family Ties, Personal and Global Conflicts in Comics. We are honored to be joined by Maggie Edkins, Fabien Toulmé, Dave Ortega, and Kalissa Erb, who will be moderating this panel.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Paduma. So as she mentioned, my name is Kalissa Erb. So by day, I am a trade sales rep at Scholastic Canada, and by night, or basically any other time, I am an avid graphic novel reader and enthusiast. So I am so excited to be here with all three of you today to talk about your works. Maggie Edkins Willis is an author, illustrator, designer, and all-around book lover. She previously worked in-house for two major children's publishers, where she designed, art directed, and illustrated dozens of covers. She is now a full-time author-illustrator with her debut middle-grade graphic novel, Smaller Sister, available June 14th from Roaring Brook Press. Fabien Toulmé originally trained as an engineer and is now a French comic book writer and illustrator. His works include Ce n'est pas toi que j'attendais, Les deux vies de Badouin, and the three-book series L'Odyssey de Hakim, which is now being translated into English. The second book in Hakim's Odyssey was recently released by Graphic Monday this spring. And Dave Ortega was born in El Paso, Texas. His self-published comic book series about the early life of his grandmother, called Días de Consuelo, was published as a graphic novel by Radiator Comics in March of this year. His other works include a comic about his grandmother's teenage years living on the Rio Grande, historical works about the Mexican Revolution, and a zine about the US influence in Central and South American governments. So thank you all so much for taking the time to be here today. I really enjoyed getting to read each of your books. There were moments when I laughed, I gasped, my heart ached, and I was really taken along for the journey. Each of these books really encompass being able to interweave family stories with larger social and geopolitical conflicts, which is a long tradition in comics itself. You balance the personal and the political. Dave, you tell the story of your grandmother and her family's crossing to the US against the backdrop of the Mexican Revolution. Fabien, you recount the long journey of a Syrian refugee to France in Hakim's Odyssey. And Maggie, you explore the connection between two sisters as one of them battles an eating disorder. So because these are such personal and family-related stories, my first question for everybody today is, what inspired you to choose this as the work that you wanted to do in graphic novel form? Should we start with Maggie?
Sure. I would say that I was inspired to write this particular story about the two sisters because my older sister had an eating disorder. And there were a number of first-person accounts of people with chronic illness, eating disorder, or at least that focused on the person struggling with it. But I couldn't find any when I was a kid that addressed the experience of someone, of a sibling, of a family member. And I felt a little bit lost about where in my family I belonged at the time. So I really wanted to write this book to help, that sort of younger version of myself, and hope that it would reach families of people with eating disorders, but also of other chronic illnesses as well, that, there might be some universality in that kind of struggle.
Yeah, definitely. Like, it makes me think of the saying about how since something's really, really personal, it makes it universal and that people can really relate to it. Dave, did you want to tell us about what inspired you?
Sure. Días de Consuelo started off as a 6-issue comic series that I self-published. And I focused on the early life of my grandmother in central Mexico and in Zacatecas. And she was born in the middle of the Mexican Revolution. And why I wanted to write it is just to be able to get her story and to have it contribute to the stories of Mexican immigrants, of Mexican Americans. Growing up in El Paso, Texas, there's a lot of historical markers about the Mexican Revolution, but there wasn't a whole lot of discussion, especially in schools. There wasn't a whole lot of education towards young people about that, even though the city itself is upwards of 80% Mexican American. So part of the story as I was developing it was to be able to add to that sort of tapestry of stories and to contribute to it. When I started off talking with my grandmother, I didn't even know that I wanted to make a comic about it. I just was interested in getting her story down because she did talk about the revolution kind of in vague terms growing up. But I just kind of like wrote that off as a kid and then got more curious about it as I became an adult and like, wait a minute, I need to get these stories down. And I'm glad I did before she died a few years ago. It was really a great way to bond with her as an adult, because you have different relationships with your parents and grandparents as you age. And so it was great to have this kind of shared moment with her before her life ended.
That's awesome. Yeah, and the way that you explain the Mexican Revolution, it sounds so complicated and difficult to understand, but when you filter it through your grandmother's story, it was really like I could connect with it so easily and understand how all of the pieces flowed together. And Fabien, would you like to talk about what inspired you to write down Hakeem's journey?
Yes. First of all, I want to apologize for my English. I'm going to try to be clear in my explanations. So when I had the idea of that comic, it was in 2015. It was a moment with a large number of Syrian people that came in France because of the Syrian revolution. And also there was other refugees from other parts of other countries. And in the information here in Europe, in newspaper, television, they were talking of them with only on the aspect of statistic, like things without humanity. And I wanted to know what is to be a refugee, to have to leave your country when you build something, when you have a life, a house, a wife, and you have to leave. And I wanted to know in details how is this type of journey of Odyssey, and that's why I meet Hakim and I interview him during 1 year and a half to know that story and to translate it in comic book. It's okay. Yeah. I'm done.
Perfect. Yeah, and it's incredible because that 1 year and a half is then split into 3 different books that you've created to tell this story. And that active translation of hearing the story and then putting it into comic book form leads really nicely into the next question I have for all of you. What was the process like in determining how much of yourself to put into the story? Because there is such a personal connection when you are hearing something from like a family member or somebody who becomes a close friend about what they've gone through. Dave, would you like to start?
Sure. Yeah, I think I struggled a little bit with how to insert myself into her story. It felt almost like I was intruding her story. My first early versions of it were just, her life in Mexico without any context. And of course, not providing any context for the reader is not good. So, I did have to go back and establish my, what was then present day relationship with my grandmother, how these interviews took place over the phone and sometimes in person. For the graphic novel, I even went back and added a little 2-page introduction just to set the stage even further, because I thought, both me and my publisher thought that it would help just kind of lead into my grandmother's story a little better. And I didn't include a whole lot of moments of me, of myself. I did look to Mouse, because that's kind of the standard of these sorts of memoir graphic novels, where you have in that case Art Spiegelman talking with his father Vladek, and there's a lot of moments of that, and that works for that piece very well, obviously. And I kind of wanted my grandmother's story to take center stage, and it was a little less important. It was certainly important to provide context of our relationship, but it was a little less important to include as many moments as Art Spiegelman did. And I also looked to other works as well, the kind of the journalistic comics of Jessica Abel and Chester Brown's Louis Riel, other sorts of biographical and memoir comics. And I had to pick what was the right balance for my work.
Yeah, it almost became kind of surprising to see you pop up, because you did such a great job of immersing the reader in your grandmother's story. But I appreciated, like, towards the end, how you balance yourself, her story, and how there is this like lineage of telling the story and passing it on. Fabien, what about you? What was the process like? You pop up quite frequently in at least the book that I read, book 2. What was it like trying to balance telling Hakim's story and showing yourself?
At the beginning, I haven't planned to put myself in the book, because the subject of the book is Hakim. And when I was writing the book, I thought that to put me in the story was a way also to make the character more close from the reader. I don't know if it's clear. Because we all have contact with refugees, but without knowing that we are in contact with them, because we don't know that they are refugees. Refugee, just people like us that had to leave his country and go in another country. So for me, the aim of putting me with Hakim is to show that we are in contact with them, and it just depends of our willing to approximate ourselves from the refugees. And there is another form of putting myself in this story, is that when I tell the story of Hakim, in reality, I am putting myself in the character of Hakim, because I have to tell the story of him without to know everything that he has lived during his journey. He tells me a lot of details of his journey, but sometimes I have to imagine how he answer a question, how he act in a situation. So in these moments, it's a bit of me in the character of Hakim.
Yeah, I think you do a really fantastic job balancing your presence. And I really felt that closeness in seeing your conversations with him in the text. Maggie, what about you?
Yeah, so when I started Smaller Sister, the first draft I wrote was more of a direct memoir. The final book is really, I would say it's based on real life without being a direct memoir. There's definitely fictionalized elements of it. The first thing I did when I came up with the idea for this story was reach out to my real life older sister and make sure she was okay with me telling some version of, our life. And she's very supportive of eating disorder advocacy and that kind of thing. But it was very important to me that I also tell this story from Lucy, the younger sister's point of view completely. I really didn't want to tell my sister's story for her, but I did want to shed light on her experience and then show how that experience affected Lucy's development, both in the way in her relationship with her sister and in the way that she sees her own body. And I wrote the first draft as a direct memoir, as I said, and then kind of realized that I would be able to include a little bit more in the story by fictionalizing it, by sort of streamlining some of the characters, combining them. And I kind of like to think of it as being a true story, even if it's not exactly how it happened. And I think it allowed me to explore some of those themes a little bit deeper.
Yeah, and I really appreciated that you balanced the eating disorder and the time spent there with the effects afterwards and how it impacts the rest of the family, because I think that's something that is not often discussed, especially in middle grade, that there's so many ramifications to things that carry on throughout the family when you go through something very stressful. And you see somebody else going through something like that. Speaking of like not quite a true story, but like close to it, I'm really interested in when we are representing something that somebody has lived through, and it is something that is quite stressful and traumatic on them. It can kind of shift how they remember it. And there's all of these pieces that are missing sometimes when they're telling somebody. So Fabien, you were talking about Hakeem, you had to imagine what he would have said in an experience. And there are moments, Dave, when you mentioned in your book that things might not have happened exactly at this time, but it's close enough that it made sense within the narrative arc. What was the process like in balancing this like truth versus story element in your works? Maggie, did you want to start with this one?
Sure. In balancing the truth versus story, I would say that one interesting thing was that in sharing the version that I recalled of this with family members of mine, we all remembered different things. Like there's one scene where that was really pivotal to my memory that really happened the way that I remember it, where Lucy's older sister draws a picture of what she thinks she looks like. And it doesn't look like her. It doesn't look like Olivia, the older sister, but Lucy does feel like it kind of looks like her. And she really internalizes that. And that's something that I really remembered from when I was a kid. And when my sister read that, she was like, I don't remember that at all. I don't remember, she's like, I was really so in my head, in my own journey, that like, I didn't pick up on that. And when my mom read it, she was like, wow, I really thought I hid some of the, gorier details, I guess, better from you than it seems like you realize. Like it was definitely really interesting and I kind of tried to weave that in, that like the people misunderstanding what the other family members are picking up on and thinking they're hiding it better than they are, and how that contributes to a breakdown in communication.
Yeah, definitely, because each person has like their own remembering of a scene, and what they carry on, it can kind of fade and change over time. Fabien, did you want to talk about your experience with this?
Yes, in the beginning of the writing process, Hakim said that for him, the main goal of this collaboration was to transmit this story to his children. So it was like a pressure on me, because I had to be the more respectful of his story. And in the beginning, I realized that it was impossible to be totally respectful of the truth, because I wasn't there at the moment when he was leaving a thing. And to increase the difficulty of the process, he wasn't speaking French, so I had a translator. So it was one more difficulty to respect the true story. But despite of that, I was really, I don't know if we say precautious in the question that I was making to him, to be the more detailing possible. For example, when he was in prison, I asked the space of the prison, the windows, the ground, how was the ground, everything, because with all that details, it was more easy to respect the truth, creating a sort of imaginating story. I don't know if we say that, but despite all that, Hakim said that it was his story with my eyes. So I think I respect the moral contract at the beginning.
That sounds like pretty high praise, to be his story with your eyes. That's fantastic. Dave, what about you?
So the story is a combination of the stories that I got from my grandmother through interviews, as well as the historical research that I had to do about the Mexican Revolution and about kind of what was happening culturally in that area in Mexico. And there's a few points where I did have to imagine situations, and I do make a point of letting the reader know about that in the back with notes. Maggie mentioned that that her choice to fictionalize the story worked for her book, and for me, I kind of think like memoir, there's a little bit of fictionalizing that has to happen to fill in some gaps. But as long as you acknowledge that, and the person that you're writing about is okay with it, I think that's fine too. Just because of the same things that you mentioned about people's memory. Memories are faulty, they're biased, there's large gaps. And so with the large gaps in my grandmother's story, I was talking with her in her 90s, and her memory was still really, really great, but there were still large gaps in the story. So there's one moment that I can think of in the first chapter where I write and I draw about the courtship of her parents. And as I was reading about some of the traditions in Mexico, that couples who were courting each other couldn't talk to each other directly. There always had to be a chaperone. And the conversation always had to be like these little benign, almost trite little sayings back and forth with each other, called dichos, which every culture has some, like a stitch in time saves 9, or something a little cutesy and innocent and completely removed from any sort of like sexual attention. So I included a scene of my great grandparents speaking dichos to each other as they're courting with each other. And there's another moment where she leaves her chores for a little bit. And the true story is that she went to go play cards with her friend. But I have that she actually was running a race because my grandmother was a really good runner, and I wanted an opportunity to kind of showcase that. But I did acknowledge in the notes each time that I took some creative liberties there. And I think that's the balance with memoir, is where to take creative liberties and being sure that your subject is okay with them and acknowledging them for the reader.
Definitely. It's interesting because memoir is thought of to be like this truthful, it's a nonfiction, but so much of it is filtered through the experience of the person's story. I wanted to pull out the dichos that you're talking about, and the way that you layer in English and Spanish. There's no translation within the actual panels. Maggie, in your book, you use sister script, which is sort of something that I felt like I was get to see the sister script. It's for sister eyes only, but I get to see it. And then Fabien, in the English translation, there's still some Arabic words, and there's still some things that show Hakeem's background. What was it like trying to determine how close to bring the reader, especially considering that these are North American readers that I am probably talking to right now that might not be as familiar with certain things culturally within your works? And how did you determine how close, how far away to bring them into, I guess, this family story? Maggie, would you like to start?
Sure, and I also apologize. There's someone mowing the grass right outside my window as I'm answering this. If that comes through, I would say I really used the Secret Sister. I wanted it to show the deep connection between the sisters, that there's like something that kind of goes below the surface. But I also wanted it to be really accessible to the reader. There's a key in the back so that a reader could translate if they wanted to, or write their own if they wanted to. And it is also an example of something that my sister and I did. We always left notes for each other back and forth. We did come up with multiple sister codes over the years, though I'm sure I could not recall one exactly as it was. I made up my own for this. But I felt like it was important to show that there's sort of a language within a family that only that family speaks with each other, that is insulated from the outside world, and that kind of endures throughout family struggle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think it ties in really nicely with like this family history and the family stories that get passed on. There are certain things that one family might use, their vocabulary, their language that is unique to them. Yeah. Dave, what was it like for you balancing English, Spanish for a readership as well?
Well, when Neil Bordeaux from Radiator Comics and I decided to publish the book, Radiator Comics decided to publish the book, we knew we needed to bring on some editors, even though a sort of final version had already been published with my self-published version. But I knew that was important, to have another set of eyes look at it. One reason is language. My Spanish is terrible. And I didn't have a translator look at the Spanish. I was using colloquial Spanish. I was using Google Translate. So we brought on a really great Spanish editor, a friend of mine recommended. And then we also brought in an editor, Dr. Teresa Rojas, to look at things culturally, and also with an eye to, she loves graphic novels. She works with graphic novels, so she was the perfect person for it. And I do acknowledge, like right before the first chapter, I have a page acknowledging what I did with language. I didn't really want to set off the Spanish in brackets. I didn't want to italicize words. I understand the role that has for a reader, but I also didn't want to like otherize the Spanish. So that was just a choice that an aesthetic choice that I'd made for the whole work, and it involved me going back to all my original art files and unitalicizing words that I had italicized before. I think it helped to make the whole thing a little more cohesive, since they're all supposed to be speaking turn of the century Mexican Spanish. And it was just a little touch and a little acknowledgement that I think that helps set the stage for the reader. I thought that was a nice little thing to do.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate it as somebody who is becoming more aware of how often other languages are otherized. And I think it is a really great step forward to put them on the same, I guess, playing field as English. So it almost makes it seem less like English is the default, and that there are so many other stories that can be told in other languages as well. Fabien, you told us originally that your interviews were translated. So you've translated them into French. They've now been translated into English so that I can read them. What was that process like for you, trying to bring the reader as close as possible with all of these different languages involved?
For me, bringing the reader to knowing the culture of Hakim was not through the language, because I don't speak Arabic. Sometimes I put some words like grandmother, that kind of words, but I don't remember that there are moments with people speaking Arabic or other languages. But to bring the reader to know the culture, I was really detailistic in choosing photos to help me to draw buildings, to draw shops, and so I can write in Arabic to say bakery in Arabic, for example, or in the food, or through these details, it allows me to bring the reader to this culture, but it was not through the languages.
Yeah, and I definitely noticed in all of the details how you really centered the different cultures and bringing in other individuals into the scene to show how they interacted and took care of each other. I think this was really effective. Speaking of what has kind of started off our panel about how these are topics that are quite difficult to talk about, that are often misrepresented or represented in a very challenging way for people to connect with. Things like eating disorders and refugees are often sensationalized or negatively portrayed or just brought down to like a statistic. But each of your books really grounds us in the experience of one family and really helps us to see how like this one family has gone through this experience. What do you hope that people take away after reading your graphic novel? Fabien, would you like to start?
Yes, I think that when we know a person personally, we automatically create a link with this person. So for me, when you are afraid of a person because of his religion, race, or anyway, it's because you don't know this person. So for me, when you read that type of book, the comic that I made, or the comic of Maggie and Dave, I think you can connect with the kind of person you are telling the story. And so you are not connecting just with that kind of people, but you are connecting with all other people. And I hope, I don't know if it's the case, but I hope that it will bring the reader to have the desire to interact with a neighbor, with other people, because I think you can find great people and great stories in any kind of person.
Yeah, that is fantastically said. Dave, would you like to add your thoughts?
Yeah, in the introduction to my book, I dedicate the book to immigrants and refugees everywhere for their heroism, and I call them among the bravest people on earth. And it's because, as Fabien mentioned, that if to leave your home and to go somewhere else, and to make an attempt to call that place home. That's asking a lot of people. There's a lot of trauma involved with that entire process, and very often, reading Fabien's book and then looking to examples, real life examples here in the U.S. Immigrants and refugees are often scapegoats, political scapegoats, because they have no political power. They have no power, so it makes them easy for the people with power to blame them for all of the country's problems. And specifically Mexican Americans over the last presidential administration here in the US were targeted pretty badly. In my hometown of El Paso, there was a horrific mass shooting at a Walmart. Mass shootings, as we know, in the U.S. are a terrible problem, a terrible epidemic on its own. And the young person, the young man who decided to take the lives of those people did so because of the amped up way that that the conversation is turned and the places on the internet that he went. But you don't have to look too deeply on the internet to find these messages. They are in the mainstream media, especially along the right. So anyway, I wanted this to be a love letter to Mexican Americans. Yes, your culture matters. Yes, you as people matter. Your story, your history, it's interwoven into the American story. And it was important for me. I'm sorry, I'm getting emotional talking about it. It's important because it's not anything that I grew up with. And if representation does matter, and I know we hear that a lot, but for a young person to be able to go into my grandmother's story and to see themselves in it and to say, I matter, that's all I really want for people to take away from this book.
Yeah, I think you've done an absolutely fantastic job with Días de Consuelo. And I feel absolutely honored to have been able to read her story and her family's story. So thank you so much for this. Maggie, would you like to share?
Sure. So when eating disorders are such an intensely personal topic, not everyone in the world will deal with an eating disorder, but everyone does have a body and everyone does experience a whole range of emotions about their body at various points. And when I read books about eating disorders when I was a kid, a lot of the ones that I read, I found to be instructional almost, that they sort of gave a lot of, in a very negative way, that they gave almost fueled an eating disorder by evoking a lot of triggering details that I compared myself to. And I really did not want that book to do this. I wanted this book to be about the emotional experience, but I did not want it to be in any way harmful or in any way destructive to someone who might be going through this. One thing that I actually think that the graphic novel format was perfect for that for a few specific reasons, one of which is that I could show some things that I could include less detail with and just infer rather than describe. I never mention any exact weights. I try to mention like individual foods as much as possible because that can be a really, a triggering thing for a lot of people. Basically tried to keep it as specific to this one experience as possible. Because I can't speak to the broad range of every eating disorder and everything that everyone experiences, but I can speak to, it's like what you said at the very beginning about the universality of specificity, that I can tell this one story really closely and that hopefully that can reflect a broad range of experiences. Yeah.
Those were such fantastic answers that I wish I could just like box up this panel right now, but unfortunately I have a couple more things to ask you all. First, I'd love to know, what are you working on now? I know, Maggie, this was your debut. You have another graphic novel coming out soon. And Dave and Fabien, you both have really extensive works in the graphic novel sphere. So I'd love to hear what it is that you're working on next. What can we expect from you? Dave, would you like to let us know?
Sure. I have a couple, I have a YA project and a middle grade project that I'm currently pitching. So we'll see how that goes. I recently made the switch from full-time work last year to doing this full-time. I was able to do that. So I'm freelancing as well. So yeah, I have a middle grade book, a YA book, and an adult graphic novel that I have in the works right now. And fingers crossed that something happens with them.
A lot of irons in the fire, so my fingers are crossed for you. Fabien, what about you? What are you working on?
I just published here in France a graphic novel with a reportage. I don't know how we say that in English, but I was in Lebanon, in Brazil, and in Benin in Africa to tell the story of three girls that are fighting for their rights. In Lebanon, it was during the Lebanese Revolution. In Brazil, it was in a favela. That was there was a project of building a touristic complex, and they was fighting to protect the favela. And in Africa, I follow a young girl that is sensibilizing the young people of it's very hard to explain. Pregnancy, young pregnancy, because it's a huge problem in Africa. And now I am working on a movie. I am a writer and the director of that movie, and we are planning to make the film this summer.
The film of the same story?
No, it's a creation. I am telling the story of a class of disabled children in a college here in France.
Oh, that's fantastic.
I don't know. We will see if it's fantastic.
Maggie, what about you?
Yes, I am working on another graphic novel. It is also a middle grade graphic novel, not about the same characters. It is another story based on my life, though this one is more heavily fictionalized. It's based on an experience I had in college, but written down in age to a middle grade audience. I was in a car accident in college with cheerleading teammates on my way to a competition, a pretty severe car accident, and suffered PTSD as a result. And it's sort of a look at this combination of cheerleading and post-traumatic stress, the teamwork and teammates that buoyed me through a difficult period in my life, and kind of the relationship between sports and friendship and mental health. I'm also working on a picture book, and I'm in the very early stages of working on another book that is I can't say a ton about it, but it is about women's rights and a topic that I feel extremely passionately about.
Oh, that sounds awesome. I am looking forward to seeing all of these works come out. I can't wait to see what they all look like when they're done. Before we go, where can people watching this find you online after they're done watching this panel so that they can follow your work? Maggie, would you like to share? Sure.
I am on Twitter and Instagram at Maggie Made This. I believe on Instagram it's maggie.made.this and just Maggie Made This on Twitter.
And Dave?
Sure, I am at daveortegadraws.com. I'm on Instagram at daveortegadraws. And if you're interested in getting Días de Consuelo, you can go to radiatorcomics.com to purchase it from them.
Awesome. And Fabien?
I am also on Instagram on Fabien Toulmé.
Fantastic. Thank you all so much for such an amazing discussion. I am so honored that I got to have my first moderating experience with all of you. And thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And congratulations for your first moderation program.
Thank you.
Thanks so much to Maggie Edkins, Fabien Toulmé, Dave Ortega, and Kalissa Erb for joining us and sharing your insights and your valuable work with us. Thank you to everyone tuning in to Family Ties, Personal and Global Conflicts in Comics, and wishing everyone a wonderful TCAF.
I hope you enjoyed that feature presentation for TCAF 2022. Before we go, I'd like to once again thank our programming sponsor, Seneca College School of Creative Arts and Animation. I'd also like to take a moment to thank the Canada Council for the Arts, the Ontario Art Council, and the Toronto Art Council for their generous support. Special thanks, of course, to the Beguiling Books and Art. I hope you enjoyed the time. Thank you so much for it, and we'll see you again soon.